Welcome to Access Your Leadership, where we share inspiring career stories and talk about ways you can level up your own leadership potential. I'm your host and coach, Hakim, and today I'm here with my buddy, Al Kenny. Al is a coach who works with people to help them achieve their goals and dreams without stress and pressure. Sounds refreshing. He also hosts a podcast with his buddy, Mark, and I had the pleasure of being on that podcast with both of them recently. Al, so great to have you on the show, buddy.
Hey man, yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. It was fun to be in conversation with you the other day on our podcast. So looking forward to this conversation with you now.
Absolutely. So we'll dive in, but before we do, what is one leadership win that you are celebrating or that is present for you as, having been something that occurred to you or happened for you recently?
Yeah, sure. I may have two, if that's all right. Am I allowed to be greedy
Two,
and
make
kind
it
of
three.
go
Yeah,
with
it's
two?
fine. Yeah.
One is just one that happened on Friday. It's a really simple one, which is more in the kind of personal space. I think both of them are in personal rather than in business or anything like that. I was flying back. I live in Manchester in the UK, as you know, but my folks live back just outside of Dublin, and I was going back to see them on Friday for the weekend, which door to door should be about 2.5 hours by the time you take in. Well, I got there 13 hours later after flight delays. Then we went to land in Dublin, and the plane was 30 meters off the ground. But because it was a little Irish prop plane, it got diverted at the last minute because they couldn't land due to the light winds. And then we went to Belfast and we got a coach down. And the reason I bring it up is because there was a time, I think, where I would have been just like super angry and frustrated by it. And it was just really nice to see on Friday. I was like, oh, so this is what's happening today. And it wasn't what I wanted. It definitely wasn't my preference. My mom and dad were waiting in Dublin, but I really saw like how there's the opportunity to still have a peaceful experience in the midst of crappy circumstances. Like I didn't want them. And I see that it for myself, and I see it, you know, as a big possibility for all of us, which is that leadership sometimes is a much more, particularly self-leadership, is in those simple moments where it's like, oh, there's the choice. Rage against the machine, or be like, oh, I can be in acceptance with this. And it was cool because I saw the impact that had on a few people around me by just being a bit more laughy, jokey, and kind of keeping people calm from being calm myself. So that was one, which is very real because it just happened at the beginning of this weekend. And then the other one, which I really am probably celebrating more deeply, is you and I have talked about our kids. My boys are slightly older than yours, but my eldest, without going into the detail, has a bit of a condition. It's a skin condition and so on. There was an option for him to get some pretty serious medication, which has some meaningful side effects. And my son is adamant he was doing it, and I was in so much resistance. And then someone close to me pointed out and said, I think you're coming from fear, and that this is an opportunity for you to kind of step into that, but not come from it. And so off the back of that, it prompted me to sit down with my son and just talk to him and say, I'm scared that something bad might happen, and that me saying yes to this, somehow that would be my fault. And I know that to say to him, I know that won't be my fault, but I wanted you to know that I'm scared, and B, for us to have an agreement that if you feel a bit funky on this stuff, that you will come and talk to me, because then that's okay. And it's your life. You've got to live your life. And we're doing that. He's on the meds, and we seem to be having good conversations about it. And so I still have the discomfort. I won't lie, even talking about it now, I can feel the
Mm.
discomfort when I go there into the possibility of what might happen. And at the same time, I'm like, I can feel both. I can feel his appreciation, and I can feel my, like, this feels right, like giving, not coming from fear, and just being able to kind of be perhaps a bit of a role model to him in this way and for myself, without it being kind of like I'm leading you through this and I'm making it my job to keep you safe. It's like a different form of leadership. It's that kind of more, perhaps it feels subtle in the context of parenting, which is the letting go, which I guess in lots of our leadership journeys, letting go is harder than holding on sometimes.
Wow. Yeah, those both resonate with me because I can appreciate that as a parent, and I can appreciate what long journeys feel like when you're not anticipating them because I drive the family to Maine every summer, and that's my boot camp. It's how to I remember being in Creator's Circle with a guy we mutually know, JP Morgan and Darren, and actually having a conversation about leading up to this drive and thinking like, who am I going to be on this trip to where I'm not going to allow myself to be negatively impacted by whining kids in the back seat, or when they get tired, or we're a long way into our drive and there's a traffic jam and it's taking twice as long to get to where we're going. And I could see the difference, not only like you said, myself, but the whole car because of how I was being in that moment. So that's a great example of how you noticed those feelings, and then were able to make that choice as to how you wanted to spend those 13 hours because it could have been easy to just be swallowed up by the frustration and anger and annoyance.
Oh, yeah, and I've got, as you can imagine, I've got plenty of examples where that might have happened. So the
Same.
contrast felt quite nice. And, it is nice to see it. And it's cool to reflect, isn't it? Just that it is a choice all the time. And it's, another mentor of mine, Michael Neal, has said, we're not experiencing the world, we're experiencing our thinking about the world. And it was just a nice, sharp reminder of that.
Yeah. You and I have had some great conversations before, just one on one with a group of a couple guys. We've met in Santa Monica. We had some great conversations there. How did your son respond to that version of his dad showing up in that conversation?
I'm smiling because I would love to say that like it got this like huge open-hearted response and he got up from the table and hugged me and he said, I so appreciate your vulnerability. I think he went, good, good, that's good. And yes, I will tell you. So in the moment, it was very underwhelming,
Mm,
but it's probably been since then. So when I ask, it's kind of like the agreement was set. And so I've noticed that he doesn't have as much irritation with my like, oh, how's that all coming along? And so there's a little bit more of an opening there because he's 17 and so he's kind of got that teenage, I'll tell you very little
yeah.
kind of info. But that's okay. And I guess I think, which is quite nice for me, I think I notice more my response in myself. I'm not suffering as much in the idea of I need to be doing X or Y, and even when he doesn't tell me anything, I'm kind of going, okay, like the fact that he's taking the question and just being with it and going, no, it's good. Or if I ask him some specific things, he gives me some specific answers. So there's not that resistance there or
Yeah.
resentment, perhaps that there was before.
Yeah, it's like you've laid the groundwork also for what that's going to create in your conversations going forward if and when they're needed.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it is that. And, and it's well, like I find with lots of things, chances are that the terrible future that's been living in my mind and scaring me half to death is just that, like my imagination going wild. And, it's like Googling. That's why they say never Google medical facts because,
Yeah, right.
it's just a terrible idea. And so I think there was a little bit of that going on.
You mentioned the subtle leadership, but as I was listening to you, I also think it's like the perfect definition of leadership because when you think about that in a professional context, and you were sort of alluding to it a little bit, there's that challenge to be vulnerable, to share openly with your team, your colleagues, your own leadership above you, where you're coming from, worried about how they might take it. And the response might just be like, yeah, good.
Mm.
So there's all of this anticipation of what it might be. And there's the anticipation of, like you were saying, this maybe it was going to be this grand gesture and he stands up and gives you a big hug, but also it doesn't have to be that because it still has the same amount of value. And in that professional context, I think about how many leaders think about what that conversation might look like if I lean in and I'm willing to do this. How is it going to be received? Is it going to create some awkward interaction in that moment, or am I going to be seen in a different way? And the reality is sometimes it's just affirming. Good. I appreciate that. And it's an acknowledgement of trust that gets to be shared.
Yeah, big time. And we would probably, I'm sure we might get into this as we go through, or we're getting into it now. The question of what's your job as a leader? It's like that was what I think I've seen in this win for me, or is I had, but the storyline in my head was it was my job to get him from A to B. And I think there's a real positive intention there, but it's misplaced. The
Mm-hmm.
intention's off kilter. And I also think in the professional leadership capacities, often that's the inadvertent trap that we fall into, and I've fallen into it. And I shared some of this with you on that same trip. It's when we make it, it's our job to get people from A to B. It seems to make sense. Yeah, like you're a
Yeah.
leader, and so therefore you lead people, and you're leading people. They've got to go from one place to another, and that's your job. And that, to my mind, now looks like such a massive illusion. And it's where so much resistance comes from because it's not that people don't want to be given direction. That's not the case. No one really wants to be told what's best for them, uh, which is very different.
Yeah. And you combine that then with a leader's lack of confidence as to whether or not the solution they're providing is right or wrong. You say, well,
Hmm.
why don't you just take that out of the equation? Don't worry about providing the solution that could be right or could be wrong. Just like you said with your son, have the conversation. You'll get to it. And that conversation can be enlightening just by your willingness to have it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So you mentioned your experience with some of this. Will you tell us a little bit about your professional background and a little bit of your journey that's gotten you to where you are now working with the people that you're working with?
Yeah, sure. My background, so I'm an Irishman, and without going, I grew up in a farm, which was interesting because it's the middle of nowhere, and I couldn't wait to get away. I couldn't wait to get away and experience the world, which led me on a couple of interesting adventures. Like I did go to uni, but I didn't really go to uni because then I got a job running it in an off license, so a liquor store, and still one of my favorite jobs ever. I ended up working there for kind of 3 years. I think I didn't go to enough lectures, but I was went to enough to pass my exam, which seems to be a little bit of a story of my life as well. Being able to figure out how to make things work without always doing it in the traditional way. But then in that, I remember with my boss at the time, I was like, "Oh, what's the possibilities here?" And he told me, and I was like, "Oh." And it was cool. It was like, oh, we could open another shop. And in that moment, I was like, oh, I've got a bigger vision than this. And that's fine. And so I stepped out of that into a job selling photocopiers and printers. And again, when I reflect back on these moments, like I look back on me in my early 20s, because I would have been about 21, and I was in a photocopier and printer reseller, and they allowed you to buy and sell your own stock, which now I like look back and go, why would you trust a 21-year-old to buy and sell his own stock? But in one of those moments, I got onto the phone with a rep, and there was a whole bunch of printers going out of end of life, and I bought them all. I was like, I'll take all of them on the cheap. There were these massive kind of A3 printers rocked into the warehouse. Like everyone was going mental, but I managed to sell them all and kind of have a great month. And I tell this story because I think part of what I got to see early on is quite a lot possible if you just kind of, perhaps back then, blissfully unaware of like the risks. I just wasn't really thinking about things. And so I just did stuff and they're like, that is crazy. And I look back in that now and I'm like, isn't it interesting how everyone thought it was crazy, but at the same time, everyone was kind of secretly pleased because it worked out really well in the end. And then I got a job offer to come to England. And again, for me, these are all little nuggets in what I now can kind of see as the tapestry of life because I was sitting in the office and it was with a security company in Manchester, and they were like, "Will you come over next Thursday for an interview? And we want you to prepare a presentation on firewalls and VPNs." And I was like, "Yeah, no problem, I'll be there." Turned around to my mate Brian in the office, like, "Do you know what a firewall is?" He's like, I think it's that thing that they put between rooms to stop fires spreading. I was like, I think I'm talking to the wrong guy. But I did, I created a presentation, went into my old uni, kind of got all the stuff that I needed, did a presentation. And again, I guess one of the benefits of being honest, at the end of the presentation, the guy who was doing the interview said, "Hey, can I ask you one question?" I was like, "Of course, ask me anything." Like, do you actually know what you're talking about? And I said, no, I haven't really got a clue what a firewall and a VPN is. And he's like, you're hired because I didn't know right up until you told me that. But now I know you're honest and you can kind of talk a good game. And so I ended up in the UK. But in all seriousness, Hakeem, like I was just going with the flow. And I don't think I was really taking life that seriously. And then, if I just fast forward, I got married when I was 26, and I still remember being on honeymoon and kind of just laying on the beach with my wife, Sean, and looking around. And I said, oh, this is all make believe. It was all built on a mountain of debt. And I said, you know what? When I get back, I'm going to get serious about stuff. And I did. And I went back in and I spoke to my boss at the time. I said, oh, I want you to know I'm going to be a sales director by the time I'm 30. And he just laughed quite rightly because he's like, you've been a joker for the last 2 years, not doing badly, but not doing great, just like not grabbing the opportunity as I saw it. And then I went on a great run, really, because I ended up being a sales director by the time I'm 30. And there's a couple of interesting little moments that perhaps I can kind of come back to, but I'll give the kind of main points first. So I became a sales director by the time I was 30 in another company. I got directed there, and then I became a sales director in another company. And we had this incredible 10-year run. Whilst I was there, we grew the company from like 25 people to 2,500 people, and we floated and an incredible experience. But across that 14 kind of year time frame, I had some pretty, I guess, profound experiences that I now look back and can see how they shaped everything exactly how they were meant to. Because at the end of that, the company was still doing great, but I was like, I got to leave now because there's some other calling for me. And I knew I'd become passionate over that period about like kind of what I was intimating before, which is at the beginning, I was that typical, I don't know what you call it, A-type driving leader. Like, we're going to get there and you're either with me or you're not. And then over the course of that period, I really came to see that there was a much more effective way, both in terms of creating amazing outcomes, but also having an amazing experience by tapping into, yeah, I probably want to say it now, tapping into humanity rather than relying on brute force to kind
Yeah.
of achieve things. And that's kind of why I do what I do now is like I probably would love to go back and I wouldn't change anything. And at the same time, I'd love to go back and whisper a few words in my ear a little bit earlier because I think it would have allowed me to have the same level of success, but perhaps with a deeper richness
Hmm.
of life's journey along the way.
Yeah. What a journey too. I mean, there are a number of things that I kind of want to go back to, but when you think about that period in your life where you were kind of just floating along, as you said, what was your practice, if you had one, for creating vision or for working towards a goal, or were you just trying to stay afloat and stay ahead of it? I mean, were you working towards something in your mind?
Not really. Like, yeah, I look back at it with fond memories. I've got some crazy, like when I say fond memories, like pretty close to the red line and never really thinking about survival per se, but just I still always knew that I would. So I would say back then, interestingly, I had just kind of a more blind faith in, oh, it'll all be fine. There's a story of me and my best mate, and he'd moved up from the south of England. I'd moved over from Ireland, and we both lived in like bed sits, like your kind of studio apartment type things, but not exactly in the life of luxury. And one evening, in the middle of the week, we realized that we literally had no money left. And so we scraped together all our pennies. And we're like, well, we've got a choice. We can either go and get some baked beans and bread, or we can go and have 2 pints of Guinness. And so we did what any full-blooded Irishman would do, and we clearly went and had some Guinness. And we both look back, and we don't know what happened after that, other than that was like the lowest point.
Hmm.
And it must have been that we just hit a point where like, oh right, okay, it's not going to be like this, and it never was. And so I would put it as like floating along, kind of. I think because I put it down to a little bit of growing up on a farm, and I think I was just enjoying kind of like being in a more busy life and having that stuff, but without ever really, I guess at that point, no, I actually at that point I just didn't even have a vision. Like that kind of came when I got serious, and then I actually created from there some pretty powerful visions, and then it became about practices and much more purposeful. Some of them really effective, and some of them effective in one way and not effective in others.
Yeah. So when you fast forward to being on the beach in your honeymoon,
Hmm.
what prompted that clarity? What prompted you having this shift in how you wanted to approach things when you went back?
I think I just saw a glimpse of, I saw a glimpse of possibility,
Mm,
but I knew that I hadn't done enough at that point to make it real. And so I kind of had the realization of you're not playing all out yet. And so it's just in that moment, one of those penny drop moments where it was like, oh, I think a lot of my life is, and a lot of what I see leadership is about seeing these moments of choice. Oh, there's a choice. What are you going to do? And I can remember kind of having that real sense of, whew, what are you going to do? And Sean doesn't remember, but I turned around to her and said, oh, when we get back, things are going to be different. Like I just knew, like things are going to be different. And so even little things like when we go back Friday evenings, when my mates might be wrapping up early and hitting the bar, I'd be 200 miles away doing a sales call at like 5 p.m. in Bournemouth with, a multi-hour drive to get home because I knew no one else would be.
and what's the bigger picture because there? Because what was that in service of? What were you trying to create from that?
Well, I still think I carry this now, and I think it's a good thing. I think it served me really well, and I've got to be very mindful of it. I'm not scared of dying, but I do have like a kind of a fear of not living
Mm,
and not living into my potential, which now I really see as infinite. I don't mean that from an egotistical standpoint. Like I
yeah.
look at you, I look at every single human being and go, there is no limit to the possibility and potential that is you other than those you put on it. And I am fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by that as an idea, both from a personal leadership perspective, coaching perspective, with my kids to kind of go like, once you start to get a glimpse of that, you either quickly look away because it's scary, because there's a personal responsibility, or you're kind of drawn to it. And I think I've always been drawn to it. I'm always like, whoa. And it's a little bit of, I don't, yeah, it is a little bit of a double-edged sword because it comes with, yeah, you get to do that. And then sometimes you kind of nick yourself because you're like, ah, there can be a bit of judgment in there. And you got to, and I have to be really mindful of that. But I think that was probably it. 26-year-old Alan, I don't think would have said it in exactly the same way, but I think that's probably the first time I got a real meaningful glimpse into that possibility and thought, oh, well, like let's get into the game and see what happens.
Love that. I mean, you use the word possibility so many times in that sentence because I think that's what it comes down to is just sort of that awareness that there are limitless possibilities. And when we hamstring ourselves or we limit ourselves by thinking that these few avenues are all that we have available to us and that this is what we have to do. And that's why the question, the answer and the story is so interesting to me because as I think about the choices that you had in front of you, you could have continued probably growing and learning and being successful. But there was this shift in you on that beach and your honeymoon to say it's all going to be different when we get back. And then it was in service of reaching your full potential. What then occurred as you're on that journey to maximize your potential, to think about the way that you live and you lead yourself and others through that? What created, you mentioned there were a couple pivotal moments, but how did that come about in your mind in a way where you decided, okay, everything was different from that beach and on my honeymoon, and now everything's going to be different as I think about the way in which I lead?
Yeah, well, I'm going to split it in kind of two or maybe three chapters. They're short chapters though, Hakeem, like we won't keep people here too long.
You got it.
So the first one when I came back, and I had a really great boss, a guy called Steve Anthony. And so I came back and I said to him, I'm going to be a leader and I'm going to be a sales director. And it took a little bit of time. Like I got serious in my job just as a individual contributor. So self-leadership, didn't have any people. And then I got a little mini team, 2 people. And like it was a disaster for the first 3 months, just a disaster. And he was great for like metaphor and stories. And he was like, Alan, let me tell you something. He's like, imagine you are the captain of the ship and I am the admiral. And he's like, as the admiral, I'm giving you the captaincy of this ship and I'm relying on you to getting this ship safely to harbor. And he said, and you've got sailors on your ship and you need to get those sailors. And he's like, but if you can't get those sailors to work with you to get this ship safely to harbor, then you know what's going to happen. He's like, if you can't do that as the admiral, then I need to get a new captain. And so you either got to get the sailors working for you or you got to get new sailors. But either which way, you got to get the boat safely to harbor. And that was probably the exact thing I needed to hear at the time because it kind of made things really clear. Like, this is your job and you've got to figure it out because it wasn't. And it was a great leadership insight as well because he's like, I'm not going to try and figure out your sailors. That's not my job. And it triggered me into, right, okay, well, if I'm going to go down, I might as well fall on my own sword. There's no point in falling on anyone else's. And so I just cracked out. I came up with my plan and I remember going back into the team. I was like, this is what we're going to do. And you don't really have a choice. And JD, I hope you don't mind my language, but he was like, you are the shittest boss I've ever had. And I was like, well, if that's true, then this isn't going to work and I'll be gone. And if that's not true, then you won't have a problem and I won't have. But either which way, you're doing what I said we're going to do. And it worked. Like we all ended up on President's Club in the Bahamas, and we were an amazing team. But and you know what? For the next 4 years or so in my career, I just ran with that, and I ran with it so hard. And some people loved it because I was very hard on people. I pushed them hard. I did care about them. Like I always say, I'm pretty confident that like I cared, but I just didn't know any other way. Like I kind of I took Steve's lesson and I took it on face value and was like, okay, great. And like I know the way. And so you guys are going to do it and it's going to work because I'm not going to let it fail. And it worked because I was successful and my teams were successful, but there was a lot of what's the word? Damage, collateral damage.
Yep.
Which I probably wasn't really seeing at the time. And my CEO, the founder of the company that I joined, I used to invite him into my kickoffs, and he would say, Alan is your leader, and he's a tough love leader. You just have to remember to look for the love, but it is there. And I used to get a little bit pissed off with that, but it was true. And then I went to this event with a guy called it was like for leaders, and it was with a guy called Dr. Chris Shambrook, who is the sports psychologist for British Olympic rowing. Cool guy. Only 5 of us turned up to this event. So he's like, should we just have a Chatham House rules? What goes on in the conversation stays in the conversation. And we were like, yep, get in. And it was really good. And there was some pretty cool people there. And I was like, oh, this is a good group to be in. And I explained how I got so frustrated with people. I was like, oh, people really annoy me. They're just not driven enough. They don't care about their performance in the same way as I do. And Chris was like, are you up for doing an exercise? And I said, yeah, of course I am. And he got me to do a visualization exercise where I had to visualize being in the person's body, the last person that had a meeting with me where I felt like this. And to cut a long story short, he was like, what do you see? Like, how do you feel at your desk? And then what do you feel outside the door? And what do you see as you come in? And what do you hear? And what do you feel? And the only way I can describe it, I had this deep feeling of abject fear.
Mm.
And I was the person looking at me. And like Chris had the hook so tightly in the way done the exercise. And he just turned around to me and said, so who's the problem? You with them. Like, oh. And then within 4 weeks of that, that had like left its mark, but I still think I was probably in a bit of denial. And 4 weeks later, I was trying to hire a guy, and we got on brilliantly. Like we got on brilliantly, and I really wanted him to join, and he really wanted to join. And I said, "Listen, last thing I got to do is got to take references." And he said, "Me too." And I was like, "That's fine. Like mine are going to come back stellar." That was proper ego. And so I got his references. They did come back stellar. We sat down for a coffee, and I was like, I'd love to offer you the job. And he said, I can't accept. I was like, why? He said, well, your references didn't come up the way that I would like them. And I said, would you just give me an insight without breaking any confidences? And he said he'd gotten told that if you're in Alan Kenny's team, you'll be successful. But if you fall down, he's as likely to step over you as he is to pick you up if he doesn't feel that you're going to be able to stay the course.
Wow.
And I was just like, oh. And I knew it was true. That was the thing. I was like, that's true. And I just thought, I don't want to be that guy. And so that was the moment where I was like, I still want to be successful. I really did care about people being successful and maximizing themselves. But I realized at that point, I was just getting it wrong in one way. It was like I was getting it right in one and I was getting it totally wrong in the other. And I decided I was going to figure out like how do you do this in a way that really takes people with you. And that became my mission for the next 8 years. And a very good friend of mine who worked for me throughout all of it. And she says that it was like being with a leader who at first was like, I know the way, and you are going to do it my way. And then she said the next version was the leader who said, you guys know the way. But she was like, but if they didn't, they still knew that you secretly kind of were like, and if not, then we'll just do it my way and that'll be good. And she said the final version before I left to do what I'm doing now was the leader. She was like, there is no right way.
Wow.
And that's kind of been, that's as I said, that's led me now. I don't think anyone's the done deal. Like I'm not the done deal. It's kind of like the story about my son. I see that lesson over and over again, reappearing for me when I need to see it to go, oh yeah, like that's kind of what leadership is all about versus being successful is slightly different.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
long-winded, perhaps
No,
long-winded there,
no,
Hakeem.
it's a great story, and it's a great example of how people develop these patterns and how those don't define us, and we're not wedded to those for the rest of our lives if we have the willingness to be a bit more aware and to notice what the impact of that is. Is that common practice for employees to be able to get references from their employers like that?
I think you can do it if you want to. I remember that
Who did he get the references from? Do you mind me asking?
he went to resellers that worked with the company, like people that I'd never worked for. He
Interesting.
went to those. He went to people that had worked for me.
Wow.
He pulled them from a few different places. And I remember, you know what? And for anyone that's out there thinking, oh, is that good? I think it's a great. I remember thinking at the time,
I love that.
I want you in my business even more now. Like how proactive. And look, to my mind, we are all leaders. And so that it was just like this great for me. I was like, you are such a great leader because you're not being like the beta to my alpha. You're not like trying to get this job. You're
Yeah.
here just as two human beings. And you're like, yeah, that's a great idea. We should get references on each other. And I think we should never underestimate the power of that. Like kind of that whether we are, it's whatever walk of life, it's showing up and being that like, oh yeah, no, I'm just here. I'm like, doing my thing, running my process
Yeah.
because it's your life, it's your gig, it's your career. And I don't know that we all grasp that, and I include myself in that really as fully. That's kind of where there's so much more available to us than we realize, but we kind of just play it a little bit safer behind the lines of societal expectations, business expectations versus get up to the edge and push ourselves beyond it in whatever capacity that might look like.
Yeah, even going back to the leadership context, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, we get to a point in your journey, in your career, in your company where you get this sense that you're beyond accountability. And I've earned you not taking my references. I'm at a place where I'm the one collecting references, but for that person to show up in that strong position of self leadership to say, yeah, and just as you are, I want to explore people's experiences of you because I'm about to give my skills, my talents, my time, my energy to you and in this team. Why wouldn't I explore that as well? So did that person end up not taking the job in the end?
Oh yeah, no, he ran 1 million miles. Couldn't get away
Yeah.
from me fast enough. And he's gone on to have a brilliant, like he's continued to have a great career. And so, I'm actually immensely grateful to him. Like at the time, it didn't feel like a gift.
Yeah.
But you look back in your life, you look back in your career, and you realize that those moments, they are a gift, because without Steve, without Chris, without, I won't say this guy's name, without these people showing up in your life, you just don't get these insights. And
So
yeah, it's funny that, isn't it?
I'm mindful of time, but I'm so curious about this. Once you had that gift bestowed upon you and you had this major realization that if this is how you were being perceived and this was the reputation that you've been building, that people are genuinely not interested in working that way with someone like that, despite all of the success that you could create together, how did you then start to make that shift? I mean, that's a big ship to turn. How did you start to think about ways in which you could improve upon that?
Yeah, I think I went on a journey of exploration. Like I got really curious about different topics. What does performance really mean? Like where does it live? How do we create it? I went and found experts, and Chris being one of them. And I started to run, even like within the company, I started to run programs on it, for all of us. So it was like, because and it probably, in one sense, I'm a little bit mindful. It was kind of one of those things for lots of people, even at the time we're doing, like if you liked it, you loved it. But it was kind of trying to expand that pull out to go, but like, what if there can be even more people in this cocoon, if you will? And so I got really curious, and I still got so much wrong and messed up, and like would still default back to these ways, and had to, and still do. You got to keep falling down and keep getting back up. But the main thing was I developed a ferocious curiosity
Mm,
for where does it live, and like what am I doing, and what's the possibility of being a different way. And then I would try things, and then I'd just see it working, like and be like, oh wow, and like the power of asking more questions. Or then even, and I don't place as much value in some of these things, but at the time they were perfect. But we did disc reports, the
yep.
kind of profiling. And I'm a D on the disc profile, and there was a member of my team who was an S, and we used to just clash. And the day we both got our reports back in this, and on an offsite. So one of the things I would do is I started running in my team. I would run quarterly offsites, 3 day long offsites. And the first day would just be on us, and everyone was like, "Oh, do we have to do this?" And it feels like it's going so slow. But I put them down as one of the best things I ever did, because I can still remember myself and this guy looking at each other as we got the report and going, oh, oh, that explains everything. And then we were able to kind of just start tapping into each other. And so I guess I became so much more interested in that. And I would say even in that 8 year journey, like by the time it was into the second half of that, whilst I was still in my corporate world, I was so then deep into it. Like that's why I left, because I just didn't have any of the same enthusiasm for the industry. And so I was just
Mm,
all about that. But yes, so I was a little bit lost, gone off track, I think, of your question. But I think when I come back to it, was getting curious. And funnily enough, in some ways, I would agree with you. It's like turning an oil tanker. And in other ways, it didn't feel like that, because it felt, I got some real time feedback quite quickly. And so it never felt really like turning an oil tanker. It just felt, I felt different. And then the curiosity and just trying different things along the way. And yeah, trying different things along the way. And it was a journey. I think I've got a few things popping in my head, but I don't want to go down too many more rabbit holes.
yeah, I think you're right to say that it could feel like turning a big oil tanker, but it doesn't have to. And I think back to there's an image that I show in my trainings all the time, and it comes up, almost every other week. And it's just this little cartoon where it's the three planks, and one person's on one side saying there are three planks, and then there's another person, depending on the angle that you're looking at, says no, it's four planks. And it can be three, it can be four, based on sort of the optical illusion that you're seeing in the image. And it's all about, just because you're right doesn't mean they're wrong. And That approach to leadership is what I'm hearing a lot of, because especially when what you think is right works, you've got confirmation that it's the right way. It's this is the path of success. And it also might not be for a lot of the people who are on that ship, as you described, getting you to that destination.
Yeah, and the point, maybe the final thing I would just say on that to round it out is I think for a while I saw it as being an either or.
Yeah.
I was that and now I need to be this. And it like the pendulum, it was like, oh, the pendulum's at the wrong side. I need to swing it and be this other thing. And at some points, I definitely think then I went too far and I kind
Mm.
of lost that a bit, some of, or lost touch with that ability to just be super direct with people. And so it definitely, as our times progressed, like I really see now, oh, that guy wasn't getting it wrong. And he wasn't getting it right. He was doing his damnedest. He was being
Yep.
the best guy he could be based on what he saw to be true. And then he just, it was like, oh, there's more. And the reason I share that is because I think that's one of the biggest leadership traps is the idea of right, wrong, good, bad. It create the binary thinking screws us up and screws our people up
Yeah.
because, that's why I say in some ways I'd love to go back and whisper the words in his ear. And then in other ways I don't want to because now I sit here with you and I just feel proud of it all. It's funny to look back. And so it was all gravy. And it's fun to see it and it's fun to share it because I guess, hopefully some of my words, some of your words, the reason we do these podcasts is just to try and kind of drop some possibility into the consciousness of
Yeah.
whoever. And if one person hears something that they go, oh, that's interesting, I might just
Yeah.
try that, then you're off to the races. And I would say that to anybody, whether it was like getting on a plane with my quilt cover, my quilt and my pillows and my stereo and my suit bag and landing in Manchester, not really knowing what I was going to do, or, trying to tell people what to do as the leader. It's just like you got to just like being in the game is the most important thing, and then your awareness whilst you're there. I think that in many ways for me is the at the fulcrum of leadership. It's like it's not about getting it right wrong, but it's about being so open and as aware as you can to see what's the possibility in front of your face right now, and then can you, as best you can, step into it, even though sometimes it feels daunting or scary or whatever, but really having that trust in yourself to go, ah, screw it, right, okay, I'm going to just try stuff. And yeah, I think that's such a place to be. That's the juice of life right there for me and for
It is.
leadership, I think.
It is. And that's why I really wanted you to share your story. And I'm so glad you did, because you had a wildly successful career. I think you enjoyed a lot of success and approaches that were effective and hit the mark. And you also realized along the way that there were different approaches that you could take that would create a different experience for you and those that you led. I think going back to something that I always think about when I'm talking to clients or I'm talking to training participants, we're always talking about asking questions, being in conversation to understand what's driving the behavior
Mm,
and driving the behavior of the other person, but also what's driving our behavior. When you were talking about defining what success is, defining what performance means, being curious in that way allows you to then not need to commit to one style of leadership or one approach. I go through sometimes these 12 styles of leadership, and at the end I always ask this trick question where I ask, so which one is the best? And everyone says, oh, number three, number six, number seven. I was like, well, you're all wrong, because none of them are the best. It's about having the ability to toggle through those based
mm,
on what the needs are, the people are in your team, where you work, how you work, what your values are, where you are in your life, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the way you've described your willingness to be open to your own evolution, what served you when, and how you could shift that in a way to where you would still be effective as a leader and you wouldn't feel the weight of it all. I mean, I think when I'm hearing you talk, I'm thinking back to leaders who may be listening to this and they're thinking, yeah, but what I'm doing works. And then if you ask the question, but like, how do you feel about that though? Do you like it? Well, no, I don't really love my job, or I don't really love the way it makes my team feel. I don't love the reaction that I get from people, but it's effective. It works. Okay,
mm,
great. So it works. So you know that works. Now, can you be open to other possibilities? Can you be open to other approaches? Can you be open to augmenting that slightly in a way that works for you and for others in the same way, but just different.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. And, I think there's just such a deep truth in that, whether it's you and your team or your life,
Yeah.
like I look back and so much, when you make it all your job, when you make leadership, it's all about you. And I don't like it's just such an easy trap to fall into, as I was kind of saying at the beginning, oh, it's my job, it's all on me. It's perhaps the most taxing place to live. And at least my experience was in many ways it becomes so suffocating, absorbing that you've got to drop off other parts of your life because you've made yourself the fulcrum for success.
Yeah.
For not just you, but for everything. It's like, well, it's me, it's my job. And I think once you see the truth of what you're saying, no, you get to create your experience of life from the inside out. Like, yes, your life is all you.
Mm.
You don't have to make it your job to make everybody else's, or that, like, if you can really see that they've got everything you've got and you tap into that, then there's a whole new possibility. And that's why I do what I do now, which is like, no, you can have the success and the goals. And like I'm all up for people going crazy on big aspirations. And you can feel really good about it. And you can
Yeah.
have an abundance of experience in the moment if you see that possibility and you see that possibility in others, and that there's no place to get to. There's no no winning line.
Right.
It's
Right.
just this, there's just now, and you can create whatever you want in this moment.
Yeah, I love that, Al. So as you think about people listening in and what we've talked about, and I feel like this is going to be part one of like, the 7-part series or something, because there's so much more that I could go into here. What's one leadership skill that you think is really important or you deem as something worth honing in on and developing to serve you as a leader?
Mm. I think it might sound like one of the most obvious things to say, but I think the biggest thing you can focus on as a leader that will make the greatest difference always is listening. And I mean, really listening. Listening beyond your story, listening beyond the kind of your responses, but just listening, getting deeply curious about what your people are saying because they know the answer. Like it's always there. And it's really actually challenging to slow down in the world that we live in. I think it's both the obvious thing and it's the challenging thing because it can look like you don't have time to listen because there's a place to get to. It can look like, yeah, 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 but we know. And it's like you don't know the answer. But when you listen, it'll be there. And so I think when people feel listened to, you create something so amazingly special with that person that they will remember you as a leader. You will be the leader that listened. And when people feel that, they will do things, and because then something magical happens. That would be what I would focus on. That would be my number one thing.
I would 100% agree with that. And I think as people listen to that answer, it's so important to understand that concept that you shared, which was, just because you're right doesn't mean they're wrong. It doesn't have to be either or, it can be both. And there's so much to be gained, even if the answer that you have in your mind or your heart is right. Listening opens you up to the possibilities of what other perspectives might be and what other approaches might be, and maybe the combination of yours and theirs ends up being the closest to perfect approach that you can have, but you'll never know if you're not taking the time to listen.
Yeah, and if I could add in one little thing off the back of what you
Yeah.
said, I think I've learned this would be my like little number two little thing that I've learned as I've gone along. Love your ideas. So you can actually say to people out loud, I have a view in this and I love what I'm seeing. And I'm really curious to hear what your ideas are. Because I would put that on the table as a difference between like thinking your idea is the right idea.
Yes.
Be in love with your idea,
Yes.
share it with all the enthusiasm you've got, and then throw out the caveat of, but hey, like who knows? Like let's see what else we can get on the table because There's always the possibility for new and fresh. And when we are in love with something and open, then we kind of move past right and wrong. And it will allow you to be this enthusiastic thing. And it can be, I poke fun at myself all the time. I say to people, oh, like, and I do. I love my ideas. Like I fall in love with them deeply. And but I just turn it into a joke and say to people like, hey, you got to know this about me. If there's one thing you should know, is like I fall in love with my ideas first. And so feel free to challenge them or point because I am also open. And I think you try that in a team meeting. If there's anyone, like if you're listening and thinking, oh, I've got a team meeting coming up, try it and just be like, I love my idea. I want to share it, but I also now want to invite this and let's see what we can see new and fresh, and just see what unfolds.
Yeah, I love that distinction too between right and wrong and just simply loving it as is and then opening it up for other ideas and other contributions. A little bit of that Nelson Mandela example we talked about, how
Mm,
leaders talk last so as to not influence the ideas of others and just leave that floor open for free sharing without that expectation. And I think so much gold comes from that. Any team I've been on that has been successful, whether I was leading it or I was part of the team being led, it was always when there was more listening happening than talking.
100%.
So, well, I've loved listening to you today. I always enjoy our conversations. Can you tell the audience a little bit where we can find you, how we can be in conversation with you, where we can learn more about you?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, I've loved every second of it, as I always do as well. So deeply grateful to you for that. Yeah, if you want to find me, Instagram, Al Kenny Coaching. You'll find me on LinkedIn under Al Kenny. And if anyone wants to reach out directly for a chat about anything, you can just drop me a note at al@alkenny.org.
Beautiful. And I'll put all that in the show notes too for everybody as they're checking this episode out. And I hope that you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed being in conversation. Al, thank you so much for being here, brother. I appreciate you, and I appreciate you sharing your journey and your story and your perspective on leadership. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a privilege, man. Thank you.
As always, I'd love to hear from you about the episode. What came up for you as you think about leveling up your own leadership game? And please, if you enjoyed the episode, I encourage you to like and subscribe. And if you want to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn at Hakim Lockdar or at lockdarcoaching.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. Keep being great, and we'll see you next time.